When women first make an appearance in mystery and suspense fiction, they are dead bodies. To be precise, they are the dead bodies of Madame and Mademoiselle L'Espanaye, victims of a homicidal orangutan in Edgar Allan Poe's 1841 mystery tale, The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Given that Poe once commented in an essay titled The Philosophy of Composition that the death of a beautiful woman was the most poetical topic in the world, we shouldn't be surprised that in the genre that Poe invented, women first appear as victims. Unfortunately, for many years, women only appeared as victims in the vast majority of mystery and suspense fiction, and rarely as leading or important characters in any other sense. One important exception to this rule emerged in 1930 with the publication of Dashiell Hammett's famous hard-boiled novel, The Maltese Falcon, which included the character of Bridget O'Shaughnessy. O'Shaughnessy was the archetype of a figure that became known as the Femme Fatale, a figure I discuss in much more detail in another lecture in this series. The Femme Fatale went on to become a dominant presence in both hard-boiled fiction and film noir. Many critics have argued that the Femme Fatale's intelligence, cunning, ruthlessness, and ambition make her a proto-feminist figure, one that should be celebrated despite the tendency of this figure to usually end up dead or in jail by the end of the narratives she appears in. There's no doubt that the Femme Fatale was a great leap forward for the representation of women in the genre compared to being the murder victim. But there's also no getting away from the fact that the Femme Fatale, although often capable of giving the private eye a run for his money, is still the antagonist of the narrative. She's not a protagonist in her own right. It's not until the emergence of the female detective that we see women as protagonists in mystery and suspense fiction. This lecture will trace the emergence and subsequent history of the female detective, paying particular attention to the female detective's impact on the genre and the way this figure is a textbook example of mystery and suspense fiction's responsiveness to its social environment. As the situation of women in society gradually changed, so too did the status of women in mystery and suspense narratives. As a result, although we haven't quite reached a state of equality, the genre has made enormous strides in including fictional representations of women that are as diverse and complex as women in the real world. The history of the female detective in mystery and suspense fiction goes back much further than you may think. Thanks to the pioneering work of critics like Katherine, today we have a much better understanding of this history than ever before. Reconstructing this history enables us to both appreciate the fact that female detectives have been around for a long time and allows us to correct the mistaken perception that there were no significant developments in American mysteries between Edgar Allan Poe's tales of the 1840s and the emergence of the private eye in the 1920s. Nothing could be further from the truth, as we'll see if we take a brief look at the career of Meta Fuller Victor. Born in 1831, Victor enjoyed a long and productive career as both a moral reformer and author. In the latter capacity, she wrote a large number of books, including many dime novels for both children and adults on a range of subjects, including westerns, romances, temperance novels, and rags-to-riches tales. For our purposes, however, Victor's most important publication is The Dead Letter, a novel she published under the pseudonym of Seeley Register in 1866. Not only is The Dead Letter a detective novel, it's also widely believed to be the first detective novel ever published by a woman in either Britain or America. Although it doesn't feature a female detective, The Dead Letter remains a landmark in the participation of women in the mystery and suspense fiction genre. Victor's trailblazing accomplishment makes it tempting to call her the mother of detective fiction. But in fact, that title is usually applied to a much more famous 19th century female detective novelist, Anna Katharine Green. Born in Brooklyn in 1846, Green went on to write dozens of detective novels and stories. Among them, she can claim a number of firsts. In 1878, Green published her first and most famous detective novel, The Leavenworth Case, which contains American mystery fiction's first series police detective, Ebenezer Grace. Even more significant is a novel Green published in 1897, That Affair Next Door, in which Green introduces Amelia Butterworth, the first American female detective in the genre. Butterworth also appeared in other novels written by Green, and she influenced the later development of female detectives in the work of writers like Mary Roberts Reinhardt and Agatha Christie in a number of ways. First, Butterworth is a spinster, which gives her an independence from men that allows her to conduct amateur detective work. Second, she's extremely nosy, opinionated, and determined. All things that help her be a successful detective, and all characteristics that we see in later incarnations of this figure. And finally, she's often involved in a mildly hostile and fiercely competitive relationship with the official police. In this case, Ebenezer Grace, the protagonist of the Leavenworth case. That last point is worth commenting on in a little more detail. Even though Grace's impatience with having Miss Butterworth interfering in his murder investigation is understandable, the fact of the matter is that he needs her. Why? Because although Butterworth resembles male amateur detectives in the sense that she's both a respectable member of society and rather eccentric, in other respects, she's very different. In particular, Butterworth, as a female detective, brings a different kind of knowledge to detective work than either male amateurs like Poe's Auguste Dupin or police officers like Ebenezer Grace. Rather than depending on either abstract philosophical or scientific knowledge or a familiarity with police procedure, Butterworth relies on what we might call common sense. This includes a deep familiarity with human nature, especially its flaws, and a mildly cynical but also very accurate understanding of how both men and women are likely to act under stressful and difficult circumstances. So when she first appears in mystery and suspense fiction, the female detective distinguishes herself by possessing a more informal and understated kind of expertise, a kind that male detectives will either look down upon or be ignorant of altogether. This allows writers like Anna Katharine Green and her successors not only to introduce a new female presence into the genre, but also to establish why she's so badly needed. From the very first, the female detective is just as effective at both protecting her society and entertaining readers as her male counterparts. In a moment, we'll look at the descendants of Amelia Butterworth more closely. But before leaving the 19th century, it's important to mention the fact that female detectives can also be found in one of the most diverse and popular forms of mass culture during this period, namely the dime novel. As I mentioned in my lecture on the dime novel, thanks to the work of critic Pamela Bedore, we now have a much better understanding of the crucial role the dime novel has played in mystery and suspense fiction. It's the missing link in the genre's history that helps us to connect the work of Poe in the 1840s and the arrival of the private eye in the 1920s. And, according to Bedour, we can also find in the dime novel precursors of genres that were to come to fruition in the 20th century, including the armchair detective, the hard-boiled story, and the police procedural. Bedour is particularly helpful in shedding light on the role that female detectives played in dime novels that deal with crime. When Old Sleuth, the prototypical dime novel detective, made his debut in 1872, his appearance signaled the beginning of the dime novel's shift away from a more or less exclusive focus on Western and frontier stories. Old Sleuth appeared in dozens of stories over the course of his long career, and the serial library that came to bear his name included the adventures of several female detectives. Kate Edwards, for example, who appeared in 2 dime novels, resembles a rags-to-riches character in the mold of Horatio Alger's famous Ragged Dick stories. Edwards combines adventurous and sentimental traits. She has the strength and cunning to find a way out of the most dangerous situations, but she also helps to redeem the toughened men she faces by sparking romantic feelings in them. Another female dime novel detective, Kate Gullet, actually falls in love with the male criminal she's chasing. The fact that they end up getting married does not cancel out Gullet's abilities as a detective. If anything, it enhances them, because she now works with her husband on other cases. Finally, a third dime novel female detective, Alice Van Camp, is a member of high society who disguises herself when she assumes her professional identity as Madge, the society detective. Her professional persona helps to restore order among members of the upper class in a way that is reminiscent of the classical detective genre. Sherlock Holmes, after all, is also very fond of wearing disguises. 2 points emerge from this very brief survey of female dime novel detectives. First, it is clear that even at this early stage, the figure of the female detective is able to assume a wide variety of types in order to appeal to different audiences. Second, like Anna Katherine Green, these dime novel authors go out of their way to emphasize that female detectives can be both successful detectives and successful women. Despite what their contemporary readers might assume, these narratives see no contradiction between being a detective and being a woman. In this sense, as Catherine Nickerson has argued, these early female detectives represent a domestication of mystery and suspense fiction in the way that they bring together crime narratives with the domestic novels associated during the 19th century with the work of writers like Louisa May Alcott and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Indeed, it could be their need for human connection and their willingness to admit imperfection and vulnerability that makes female detectives such effective and game-changing protagonists in the field of mystery and suspense fiction. This balance between the domestic and the detective is worth keeping in mind as we now turn to an examination of 2 of the most prominent female detectives of the so-called golden age of British detective fiction, Agatha Christie's Miss Jane Marple and Dorothy L. Sayers' Harriet Vane. As I mentioned earlier, Miss Marple is more or less a direct descendant of Anna Katherine Green's Amelia Butterworth, not least because she's a spinster. This might initially seem like a minor detail about Marple, but I think it's crucial to understanding both the appeal of this character to readers and her success as a detective. Sherlock Holmes is notorious for his belief that strong emotion, especially love, and intellectual analysis simply do not go together. This is why he refuses to ever become emotionally involved with a woman, and why he tends to look down on and sneer at those who are weak enough to fall in love. Incidentally, the Holmes story, A Scandal in Bohemia, in which Holmes is outsmarted by a woman named Irene Adler, could be read as Doyle's reminder to Holmes not to underestimate women. But the point is that Holmes remains firm about avoiding romantic feelings over the course of his career. Miss Marple is not as strict about the subject as Holmes, and is altogether a more emotional character than Doyle's famous detective, especially when it comes to feelings of kindness and empathy for others. However, her status as a spinster does indicate a similarity between her and Holmes. Like Green's Amelia Butterworth, remaining unmarried and therefore unattached allows Miss Marple a degree of freedom to pursue her vocation of being an amateur consulting detective in a way that she may not have been able to do if she were married. Unlike the female dime novel detectives, in this case, it seems that Christie is suggesting that detective work and emotional involvement may be in conflict with each other for women. This impression is confirmed when we look at Dorothy L. Sayers' famous creation, Harriet Vane. Sayers first introduces Vane in her 1930 novel, Strong Poison, when she is on trial for her life and Lord Peter Wimsey proves her innocence. In the next two novels in which she appears, Have His Carcass and Gaudy Night, there is ample evidence that Vane has the makings of an excellent sleuth in her own right. It's very difficult for the reader to judge whether or not this is indeed the case, however, because Vane's professional identity as a detective, or at least the potential for her to assume such an identity, is always bound up with her relationship with Wimsey. In Gaudy Night, for example, despite conducting the majority of the investigation herself, Vane eventually turns to Wimsey for help, and it surely cannot be a coincidence that the resolution of the mystery coincides with Harriet Vane accepting Wimsey's proposal of marriage. Being a female detective can either be very similar or very different from being a male detective, depending on the emotional attachments that the female detective forms or doesn't form with others. If one chooses to be a female detective in the Holmes mode, like Miss Marple, several obstacles to becoming a detective may be removed. Conversely, if one chooses to occupy the role of wife as well as detective, like Harriet Vane, then the matter of professional identity may become considerably more complicated. Given the ways that they explore the tension between personal and professional identities for women, mystery and suspense narratives featuring female detectives perhaps deserve more credit for their realism than they usually receive. It's interesting to note that this tension between the personal and the professional can also be found in much more recent narratives that feature female detectives. In his 1998 novel, The Number One Ladies Detective Agency, for example, Alexander McCall Smith tells the story of Precious Ramotswe, a young woman in a small town in Botswana who opens her own detective agency. The novel describes the various trials and tribulations she goes through in trying to get her business off the ground and the challenge of trying to get people to take a female detective seriously. In this context, when Precious agrees to marry Mr. J.L.B. Matacone at the end of the novel, we're torn between feeling happy for Precious and being concerned that acquiring a husband might mean the end of her fledgling career as a detective. The persistence of these kinds of concerns in mystery and suspense narratives featuring female detectives means that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to draw a line through the history of the genre that gradually curves upwards to signify the steady and unrelenting march of progress. Instead, what we have is a series of fits and starts that suggest that progress, in terms of the representation of women, has been very uneven, partly because what counts as progress differs according to which aspect of the genre we're studying. Let me give a few examples to demonstrate what I mean. For many years, the genre of the police procedural, both in written form and on television, was dominated by male characters. The situation is very different today, but that change would not have come about were it not for trailblazing shows like Cagney and Lacey, which debuted as a television movie in 1981 and then became a hit American television series starting in 1982. Developed by Barbara Corday and Barbara Avden, Cagney and Lacey featured two female New York City homicide detectives and was reportedly the world's first dramatic television series to feature women in both starring roles. Then there's Prime Suspect, a British television series written by Linda LaPlante that debuted in 1991 and starred Helen Mirren in the role of Detective Chief Inspector Jane Tennyson. Even more than Cagney and Lacey, Prime Suspect explicitly addressed the issue of institutionalized sexism in the police force and the impact that it had on Tennyson's career. In this way, the series was also able to offer a self-conscious commentary on the need for the police procedural genre, as well as the institution of the police, to diversify itself in terms of gender. And with regard to written police procedural narratives, an often overlooked landmark is Katherine V. Forrest's 1984 novel, Amateur City, featuring female Los Angeles detective Kate Delafield. In fact, this was a double landmark in the sense that Delafield was also the first openly lesbian character to appear in a police procedural. Over the course of a number of other novels featuring this character, Forrest created a pioneer in police procedurals who would also become one of the best-loved and most influential characters in lesbian mystery and suspense fiction. This is an appropriate moment to acknowledge the importance of another female character in thriller fiction whose significance is often overlooked because she shares the stage with one of the genre's most notorious figures. I'm referring to Thomas Harris's Clarice Starling, who first appears in his 1988 novel, The Silence of the Lambs. From the beginning of both Harris's novel and Jonathan Demme's famous 1991 film adaptation, it's clear that the FBI is a boys' club that is reluctant to make space for a woman like Starling. Thanks to her boss, Jack Crawford, who has a somewhat paternalistic but nonetheless supportive relationship with her, Starling gets the chance to work on the Buffalo Bill serial murder case. But this involves going toe-to-toe with the infamous serial killer Hannibal Lecter. Although Lecter toys with her as he does with everyone, Starling eventually wins his respect. In doing so, she demonstrates not only her strength as a character, but also her skill as a detective. As the hunt for Buffalo Bill heats up, Starling begs Crawford to let her go out into the field, even though she's still a trainee. As a female FBI agent, she possesses skills that male agents do not. "Send me," Starling says to Crawford. "I'm as good as anybody you've got at the cop stuff, better at some things. The victims are all women, and there aren't any women working this. I can walk into a woman's room and know 3 times as much about her as a man would know, and you know that's a fact. Send me." To his credit, Crawford listens to Starling, and she repays his confidence when she later realizes how and why Buffalo Bill is choosing particular types of victims. Hannibal Lecter usually gets all the credit for the success of Silence of the Lambs, but the time and effort Harris puts into the character of Clarice Starling makes her a formidable member of the pantheon of female detectives. It's ironic, then, that in his later novel, Hannibal, Harris infuriated many of his readers by having Lecter and Starling become lovers. It's not clear why Harris did this. Perhaps he wanted to undermine Clarice's independence. Perhaps he was being deliberately provocative. Or perhaps it was just a blunder on his part. The controversy did at least have the virtue of underlining just how attached readers can become to strong female characters in mystery and suspense narratives. I'd like to conclude this lecture by discussing the variety of mystery and suspense fiction that in some ways held out the longest against the incursion of female detectives, and that's the private eye narrative. Why did it take so long for women to make an appearance in this particular genre? I think it's because the private eye, even more than the detective, has always been regarded unofficially as a male figure, if only in the sense that the private eye often dramatizes the difficulties as well as the advantages of being a man. Thus, for many years, it was particularly challenging for both writers and readers to imagine what female private eyes might look like. Given her reputation for writing rather traditional mysteries in the Agatha Christie mold, it might seem surprising to note that P.D. James produced one of the earliest female private eyes in the person of Cordelia Gray, who first appeared in James's 1972 novel An Unsuitable Job for a Woman, and later returned in The Skull Beneath the Skin. Considering that Christie herself was something of a trailblazer when she introduced Miss Marple in 1930, however, James's character becomes more comprehensible and less surprising. Despite the popularity of competitors like Marcia Muller's Sharon McCone, Sue Grafton's Kinsey Milhone, and Janet Ivanovich's Stephanie Plum, for most readers of mystery and suspense fiction today, one figure personifies the female private eye, and that is Sara Paretsky's Chicago private investigator V.I. Warshawski, who first appeared in Paretsky's 1982 novel Indemnity Only. Paretsky is arguably the best known and most successful of a group of women mystery and suspense fiction writers who began publishing in the early 1980s. They all used and challenged the conventions of hard-boiled fiction by producing politically committed, feminist private investigators, women who were neither victims nor predatory femme fatales. Paretsky once told an interviewer that one of her motivations in creating VI was to try and combat some of the typical sexual stereotypes in literature. According to Paretsky, too many of the women characters in literature, not just in mysteries, are either predatory or helpless. So successful has she been in this goal that her novels have been translated into more than 20 languages and have changed the face of the genre. Paretsky had the idea of writing about a female private eye for 3 or 4 years and made several false starts before finding the right path. As she once explained in an interview, "At that time, I was a middle manager for a large multinational company. In 1979, I realized that I was trying to create a character who was aping the Raymond Chandler tradition only in female form. And what I really wanted was a woman who was doing what I was doing, which was trying to make a success in a field traditionally dominated by men. With that realization, I was able to find VI's voice." Having enjoyed a great deal of success in her own career, Paretsky has sought to nurture women mystery writers and to scrutinize the portrayals of women characters in the genre by founding the group Sisters in Crime. She has also edited several anthologies of detective fiction by women. By far her most important contribution to the genre, however, is the character of VI. The things I want to say about law, society, women seem to come naturally in her voice, Paretsky once said. There's no doubt that VI is an enormously popular character, but it's important to remember that at least at the start of her career, she was a somewhat controversial figure. Some early readers and reviewers of Paretsky's work felt she hadn't done enough to revise the male form of the hard-boiled private eye, and that VI was essentially just Sam Spade in drag. What these reactions missed is that despite appearances, both VI and, by extension, the other female detectives we've discussed in this lecture are very different from their male counterparts. In VI's case, while she may be a loner, she also has a community of friends, including her neighbor, Mr. Contreras, and a doctor named Lottie Herschel, who she draws on for support in every one of her cases. Although she's capable of being violent, she does whatever she can to avoid violent situations, and usually succeeds. And although she's tough, she's also vulnerable in a way that the male private eye would never admit to being. This combination of qualities makes VI a relatable character while never detracting from her ability to go toe-to-toe with the criminals in Paretsky's novels, the majority of whom are men, and get the job done. Characters like VI and the other female detectives we've looked at in this lecture have expanded our sense of what it means to be a detective, and for that, we are all in their debt.